Good afternoon to the internet, to the world. I'm Floyd Hall, and I am honored and privileged to be moderating a conversation today on behalf of Adama. This is Art Salon number 25, the quarter century milestone art salon, where we are going to be engaging in a conversation about this intersection of arts and politics, given this political season. And I'm super thrilled to have some amazing conversationalists today. Some of them, I'm sure most of them you probably already know, but just glad to assemble all this amazing talent and these perspectives. So I'll give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. So starting with, at least on my screen from left to right, Heather, could you please give the people what they want and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Heather Infantry. I am the founder of the Atlanta Task Force for Philanthropic Reparations that was created last year in response to the exclusion of Black arts organizations and funding from the Community Foundation. And then most recently, I've taken the helm of the Transformation Alliance, which is a membership collaborative focused on equitable transit-oriented development as a pathway for Black wealth and prosperity. So happy to be here with everyone.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for being here and sharing your perspective this afternoon. Insay, over to you.
Let's try this again. Peace, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Nsé Ufot. I'm the CEO of the New Georgia Project and the New Georgia Project Action Fund. We are a nonpartisan civic engagement organization based here in the great state of Georgia, and probably best known for our large-scale voter registration efforts, where to date we've registered almost 600,000 Black and Brown folks in all 159 of Georgia's counties. And yeah, we work to change the culture of political participation and change the culture of organizing. And in service of that mission, we consume a lot of creative talent. We are purchasers of creative talent and are in community with a lot of artists as activists. And so, yeah, we're going to change the culture. You got to work with culture workers. And so really happy about the work that we're doing, really happy about the direction that our state is moving in, despite all of the awfulness that gets reported, and happy to say more later.
Awesome. Glad to have you as part of this conversation. I feel like this is going to be so fruitful of a dialogue. We also may be joined by Fabian Williams at some point in time in this conversation. So I wanted to at least acknowledge Fabian as part of this dialogue as an artist, activist, practitioner of culture in the Atlanta area and beyond. So Fabian may jump in at any point in this conversation, but at least wanted to at least acknowledge that. I want to sort of start off with a bit of an acknowledgement. I know before we hopped on, we're kind of chatting amongst each other about kind of where we are right now. And I think Heather, you mentioned in a way that the current state of local politics was concerning you right now. And I wanted to maybe give you some space to articulate that, or sort of get that off your heart, off your brain into this space, and maybe kind of give us a chance to maybe dissect that a little bit more.
Oh, wow. Yes. So I live in Reynoldstown. Which is named after Madison Reynolds, who was a Black man, a free Black man who settled into this community, owned a storefront, had a home, and this neighborhood is named after him. And a lot of folks don't know that, because if you go into my neighboring First Watch brunch place, they have a brook and a pastoral scene, and they're like, that's Madison Yards is sort of the depiction that's presented there. So there's just this I'm struggling right now in this place that I live in at this current time, following all of the social unrest and this pandemic that is unending, trying to reconcile the Atlanta that I fell in love with when I moved here in '95, that was all encompassing of Black culture, space, energy, and how it continues to sort of move away from that very centering Black space that so enveloped me in such a nurturing and loving way. And when I look at the election cycle right now and our candidates, and I'm very disillusioned. I'm very disillusioned, and I'm not quite sure how to make sense of it. I am still trying to figure out how to participate in a meaningful way that's productive, but feeling that even my participation is kind of futile. And so it's always good to be with Nsé, who's doing the hard work on the ground, reminding us that like at every turn, there's opportunity for us to change the course of these things. But man, the mountain it's a tall mountain. It's a tall mountain.
You know, and I wanted you to share that, Heather, because I feel like other folks may feel like you. I feel like there's, I think, a lot of folks who that may resonate as they're hearing this conversation or seeing this conversation, especially folks who have been in Atlanta for 20 plus years or enough to have observed a lot of the changes in the city. And so for some housekeeping, you know, there's a lot of attention that's always paid to the national elections, the national election cycle, both presidential years as well as midterm years. But in Atlanta, our mayoral election is always like off of that, you know, general calendar. So there's oftentimes a little bit of different political energy that kind of surrounds our mayoral election. But then we're also looking forward to 2022, where we'll have gubernatorial election as well as some other Senate seats. And so I guess for you, Nsé, when you hear someone like Heather, and there may be 1,000 Heathers out there, you know, who may share that same perspective.
A million Heathers.
You know, many Heathers, you know, millions of Heathers, like, you know, who are frustrated and maybe are trying to grasp in terms of where they fit, where their energy should be directed, and how to be engaged in a process that feels as though it's difficult to navigate at this point, or to, you know, have the impact that they want to have at this point. When you hear that, what do you think? How do you respond, and how do you receive that, but also like put it back into the world?
Yeah, like I said, there are a million Heathers in our state alone, let alone the country. I'll say this: I'm an Atlanta public school graduate, and we are raised on a steady diet of Martin Luther King quotes. And there's one that comes to mind when I hear that, which is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. Now, when that quote is invoked, it's often referencing the work that people are doing to bend the arc of the universe towards justice, right? Like, what are you doing to bend the arc, et cetera? I also think about the fact that it's long. It's very, 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 very long. And that it's the history of democracy in this country and the history of sort of marginalized groups in this country, that it has been a constant battle, a constant push to expand the definition of citizen, and who has rights and responsibilities, and who has access to the franchise, access to the tools of our democracy. And so in this moment, people might feel some kind of way, because as we have made significant steps forward, you know, from, you know, Atlanta, the airport doing well, known as a Black Mecca, 2 million people moving here in the past decade and a half, that there's also basically white lash. And for all the 2 steps forwards that we make, there's, you know, oftentimes a corresponding attempt to push us backwards, to take us backwards. And so like what people are feeling is we're in the middle of a real battle. A battle for the future of Georgia, and a battle for the future of this country, and that we aren't going back, right? And so this sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-generational pro-democracy majority is present here in the South, and they got something to say. And so, yes, the mayoral race in Atlanta is a whole mess, but that's also not uncommon, right? For narcissists and people who should not be running, people who can't lead their families, let alone lead a city, coming in to tell us that they want to come and lead us. And like, again, that's not new. And so I think my thing is to make sure that when I'm talking to people who are feeling despondent or who are just feeling the weight of what we are seeing right now, is that one, it has been a constant push to, it's always been the work of the people to hold elected officials accountable and to make leaders do what they're supposed to do. But also too, that there are 1,600 municipal elections in Georgia on November 2nd. So the city of Atlanta mayor's race is one, but there's tons of school boards where 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds are running for school board. There's tons of cities where there's queer folks and young people and Black folks running for mayor and city council for the first time and who have a real clear vision. And so, yes, Atlanta is our home. Yes, there seems to be, again, messiness and foolishness that is a feature of our municipal elections. And yes, there's still opportunities for us to weigh in, to get involved, to plug in, to fight for, as opposed to letting things happen to us, fighting for the vision of Atlanta, fighting for the vision of Decatur, Georgia, that we have for ourselves and our families.
And so one of the things that I want to get Heather, I want to get you to maybe, expound upon Heather, or at least observe, give some perspective to, as Fabian joins the call. Hello, Fabian. Welcome to the conversation. And glad to have you as part of this. But before we jump into you, Fabian, I want to get you to chime in on this, Heather. It seems to me that in presidential elections or those election years, the arts community feels like it's more vocal in a way. There's more arts production in a way. More of a pathway forward or outward. That sort of corresponds to either presidential or even just like national level elections. Like there's a rhythm to that. But I feel like for these hyper local elections, I don't see the same level of production or like vocalizing what's important in this local space. I think people feel a little bit less empowered to use their voice in a certain type of way that we feel is very prevalent when we're talking about national or statewide elections. So I would just love for you to maybe speak to your observations to that. If I'm if you don't agree with what I'm sort of characterizing it, feel free to help me reframe that. But I would love for you to maybe just speak on where the arts conversations are happening as the sort of scale of the elections are being presented to us.
I think the challenge that I've experienced, and I've been part of so many committees and initiatives and a variety of efforts to rally some sort of like political platform for the arts community. And I think those efforts have been challenging for a number of reasons, right? One, many voices at the table trying to find consensus is oftentimes really difficult. And for me specifically, what really only became an epiphany last year was the importance of separating out a multiracial agenda, a multiracial political agenda, because where I was finding a lot of, an impediment to progress was around the equity piece. So I'd been part of so many conversations, multiracial spaces, where we were beginning to center equity, but there wasn't an adequate representation of Black voices. And when some of the conversations sort of swayed towards trying to get in front of elected officials and putting talking points together, I was realizing like that's a really futile effort for Black folks that have been often disillusioned by a political system, right? And the minute I started extracting the focus of the conversation around the needs of the Black arts community, everything became a little bit more clear to me about what the focus and the direction needs to be for those organizations. So I think sometimes the consensus building part of it, when everybody at the table has very different needs and a very different history with regards to a political system, I think so that becomes challenging because more often than not, the white voices are sort of louder in those settings. So thinking about even how we engage politics right now from a very Black-centered space is a very new conversation for me, but it's a clearer conversation. Like it's clear for me to address and identify the need for funding or changes in ordinances and legislation around access to facilities and spaces that maybe I just couldn't see when I was more so in white-centered spaces. I do think that, Black creatives, Black artists, Black cultural workers have a unique opportunity right now to capture the intention of like politicians through their art. Like I think there's a fierce sort of urgency, and I love what Ense has been doing with her organization in terms of like capturing that attention. But I think so much of it also comes down to a sense of our own agency, and our own sense of like they represent us, right? At the end of the day, they represent us. We have a voice in this situation, and when things are not being provided to us in the way that we need them to, that's a place for us to rally. And that's a great place for us to use our art as a creative outlet to call out and to share our position and stance on these things. And I think so much of it just comes down to like not acknowledging that, not recognizing that, and then acting on that. But I do think, like going back, like being in some of these mixed groups, I think for Black artists has made it really difficult to zero in on that, because then, the whole cause gets co-opted by someone else's interest.
And I think to Heather's point, just to draw a little bit of context, like there have, been consistent, efforts and energy around arts agendas for public officials. Like there's always a movement around how do we organize to rally for, more arts funding, at a state level, or how do we push for different policies around, public art ordinances in the city? How do we, come together or try to come together to, be unified in a certain way? But there's always seemingly a bit of a like regeneration of that wheel every few years to try to start it up again before it kind of dissipates, and then we start up again, and then it dissipates. So I wanted to at least like, co-sign / acknowledge Heather's point to, there's always a bit of an ebb and flow to this conversation, depending on kind of where things are economically, politically in the city, et cetera, et cetera. But now that Fabian's here, I do want to bring the artist perspective into this. Fabian's work, for those of you all who are on the call watching us, Fabian's work is, for as long as I've known him, has often been politically, rooted in the policies and the politics of kind of where we are. And I think we're catching Fabian currently working. As I see the hallmark of your labor, sir. So thank you for taking some time away from a mural project, I'm sure, to join in this conversation. But while we're here, one, maybe sort of talk about where the drive for your work comes from, and what are you seeking to foster or advance when you're talking about, when you're using your art to advance certain conversations. What is your intention when it comes to the intersection of art and politics in your work? We can't hear you, Fabian. We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Sorry for being late. Interesting morning. I won't talk about it. But you're saying, why do I? What again?
What is your intention at the intersection of art and politics right now?
Part of it is like to voice my frustration. Because I tried saying what I'm saying through, Twitter and Facebook, and my words don't really hit as hard as the images. So, I'm just using the best medium that I've been blessed with to talk about the things that I think are important. So it's sort of like, it's the best option I had, and probably the cheapest, and I have to pay myself that much.
Thank you for that, Faith. And for those in the Atlanta area, I'm sure, Fabian, there's probably a map of your work, or a map of where your works are located throughout the city.
There
not where it needs to be. But Fabian's work.
I'm actually working on that with Spellman, to map my work around the city. So I'm glad you said that.
Just trying to just set you up. That's it. That's it.
You own it.
Okay. So for those who are in the Atlanta area, and for those who are not, there'll be a map coming soon, that will sort of list or sort of show where Fabian's work is in the Atlanta area and probably beyond. But I think that I think Fabian's work is very responsive to what's happening politically, in a variety of ways. But for you, Insay, as you hear Fabian talk about his art being the pathway to feel heard in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily translate to some of the other platforms that we have. When you hear Fabian talk and thinking about civic engagement, what role would you want someone like Fabian to play in engagement, in fostering conversation, in advancing conversation around being present and active in our local political movements?
Yeah, I think he already hit it. When I think about artists and culture workers, first of all, the politics is not like some, external ephemera, right? Like, it is literally one of the tools or one of the ways that we make decisions collectively as a society, as a city, as a county, and state, about how we're gonna spend our money, about what our priorities are, right? And so when I think about culture workers, when I think about artists and how they show up, I think as artists, as citizens, right? Like, I live here, I drink this water, I breathe this air, my babies go to these schools, right? I drive these roads. I am engaged in some sort of commerce, like some exchange of value for my labor in this place, right? And I have thoughts and opinions about how these things should go. And the people who are going either to City Hall or to the state capitol or to Congress to do the people's work. And I am the people, right? As an artist and as a citizen, I am the people. And so, yeah, I would encourage people to show up. People are thinking about the interventions that they're going to make. Like, what are you as a whole human? What are your priorities? I would say that the way that we train our organizers and our campaign staff is that we tell them that you have twice as many ears as you do mouths. And so, to a point that Heather made earlier, getting real clear about your who and your why, right? And so if your who is Black creatives, right? Black culture workers, then asking the questions about what the priorities are. What are the things that people can't stand to see continuing? And what is the Georgia, what's the Atlanta, what's the US that they want to build for themselves as workers, as artists, as creatives, as storytellers, but also as mamas, as daddies, etc. So artist and citizen, I think, is the first thing that I want people to think of. And then secondly, as I hate to reduce people to their labor or reduce people to the marketplace value of their labor, but like thinking about how art and culture are a powerful economic engine for our state and for our city. I think that leaning into that. Like, we make this place cool. People want to live here because of our contributions, because I exist and I do what I do, and you know it. And so, like, how do we make sure that we command the resources so that people can, like Fabian, can continue to do what they do to make our city attractive and wonderful, and a place where people want to be seen and live. And like, so artist as citizen, and then artists as people who are part of a system that make this place what it is, who help shape this place. And so have thoughts, opinions, ideas about how to maintain the goodness that is attracting people here. So you're on mute, your turn.
Happens to all of us. I do want to make sure that all of us all the folks who are in the audience, there will be time for question and answer for our panelists. So if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. So I think that's a great segue into having some bit of a dialogue about what are the priorities that we think about from our arts and culture community. Fabian, Heather, what are the priorities, whether they be arts related or not, that if we're talking to our policymakers, both at the mayoral level, that's through our elections that are happening in the next couple of weeks here, but also just statewide, nationally, what are some priorities that are present just in your individual lives right now, or that you see for the culture and the community as we know it? Fabian, and then Heather.
Well, my priority right now is I'm future focused. So a lot of the work that I'm addressing now is about Black people thinking about what they want from the future. And what you want is actually hard to think about when you're used to getting so little for so long. So when you like really start to think about like, what is like peace like to me? What does it look like? When I first started thinking about it, I got nothing at all, because what I was feeding myself was despair. When I pick up my phone, I see, videos of us, like snuff videos, between us and police, or just us on us. And I was like, well, I don't like this, but what do I like? And when you try and think about like a highly functioning, technologically proficient, culturally rich future, the only thing that I could really think of was Wakanda. And that got destroyed in the second Marvel movie that came after it. You know what I mean? So what does that future look like with us in it, where we don't have like the shackles and the barriers of racism and this caste system that we find ourselves in? What does that look like? And I had to really like look hard and think about it. Luckily, there's a lot of shows out that are exploring the future, in a sort of a Eurofuturistic way. Foundation and now Dune. But the stories that the visuals that I'm seeing don't look anything like what I've seen. I'm leaning more towards Octavia Butler. And books like Lilith's Brood. I like some of the thinking behind their approach to technology and living, and they're anti-war. So I'm looking at the future. I don't call anything Afrofuturism, because I feel like the future is the future. And, I don't feel like we should label our future. Just like, nobody's going around saying Eurofuturism. You know what I'm saying? It's the future. It's the future because it's the future. If it ends up being Black centered, it's still the future. So anyway, that's where my brain is going.
Heather, same question to you. What are some of the priorities that you're thinking about, or whether it be strictly arts focused or even beyond, that are just informing where your head is right now?
Yeah, my focus is on the arts because I really do think the artistic community is the answer to everything that we're trying to understand and solve for. I think it rests with us. I think it always has. And specifically, I am really trying to unlock this funding piece from two standpoints. One, I want to unlock and expose in a lot of ways historically the redlining that's happened to Black arts organizations and to Black artists in Atlanta, right? Which is interesting when there is agreement among most everybody that cultural expression is something that Black folks do, right? We can all agree across ethnicity and race that Black folks do art. And for a Black city like Atlanta to have the kind of historical track record where white institutions have redlined us from doing the thing that we all agree that we do well, and that in its contribution, like brings joy to everybody, is I think one of the greatest injustices of this community and of the leadership of these institutions. But also to that point, I think it behooves us as members of these creative communities to acknowledge, like, from the beginning, there has been an exploitation of Black people, Black bodies. And as such, we cannot continue to sacrifice the work that we do to pander to these institutions that will never ever recognize us. So when do we get to a point where we begin to construct models and systems that sustain us and give us the autonomy and latitude to produce the art that is urgent and allows us to imagine a future for ourselves that is not wholly tied to these Eurocentric ideals, right? So that's the main focal point, is around the money, because the money part is what captures everybody's attention. It's how this city moves. And specifically really wanting to reframe the conversation from one where we talk about Black organizations and Black artists being underfunded or under-resourced, like all these epithets that we use: under-resourced, marginalized, disenfranchised, when really the conversation needs to be shifted to these institutions that are poverty pimps. They are crimes against, criminals against community. Like, how do we begin to reframe and put the wanted posters of these heads of institutions that have the authority and the resources and are intentionally making decisions to make sure that we aren't getting them? And that's the fight that I'm in, that I'm committed to.
Smoke in the city, and I am here for it. I know that this question was for artists, but I have priorities too.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that the thing that I'm focused on right now in this moment is just some basic, like, meat and potato issues for just working people and Black folks in the city. So I'm thinking aggressively about, like, the path to an increase in the minimum wage. I mean, although a lot of people don't make the minimum wage, the idea is the lower the floor is, it drags everyone's wages down. And so with the minimum wage in Georgia being $5.15 an hour, it's below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Like, the culture of undervaluing people's contributions it will continue to proliferate. It's one that will continue to live in, and it will affect everyone, like I said, even if you aren't a minimum wage worker. And so really working to dismantle that culture. And then I think also I've been thinking a lot about truth telling in this moment, that there are a lot of people who are running, particularly in Atlanta, who just be lying. Like, you out here all cap. And I don't think that it necessarily started with them. I think that we are moving into an age of misinformation and disinformation, right? As hot wars become more and more expensive and countries turn to Cold War tactics that are just as likely to destabilize a government. When you get people not believing in government, when people not believing in the news, when people not trusting the information that's coming out, whether or not it's about elections, if it's about vaccine, if it's about wars, et cetera, if it's about the crime rate in the city. We did a poll that told us that 80% of Atlanta voters felt like crime was on the rise and was a problem in the city. And then 88% of folks in Atlanta had not personally been a victim of a crime in like the past 7 to 10 years. So that tells me that that's an information war, and about how people are talking about our city, and that there are people whose interests are served when folks are fearful, that there's a type of posture that people adopt when we're going to vote in the middle of a war. That it tends to be male leadership, it tends to be authoritarian leadership. We tend to want bullies and people who come out and be like, I got you, I got your back, right? And so creating, like, so misinformation and disinformation serves a particular interest, again, as it relates to the vaccine, as it relates to this pandemic, as it relates to voting and elections. And so digital media literacy, right? And making sure that like my nephews who are Gen Z and my mama, who is a boomer, they're both equally subject to misinformation and disinformation on the internet, but for completely different reasons. That we are thinking, again, with artists and storytellers about how we cut through the noise, how we penetrate through the crack, through the cap, how we penetrate through the BS, to make sure that people are getting good information that they can rely on, that they can make decisions based off of.
Thank you all. Thank you all for that. I want to also remind people that please, if you have questions or points that you want to add, feel free to use the chat as well as the Q&A. And I want to pull in one question from the Q&A that I was about to ask, but I think it's just sort of, perfectly timed. Atlanta as a city that has a Black narrative so strongly tied to it, Atlanta is also part of this larger, African diaspora in terms of, being on the continuum of both in this American space, but also sort of with ties to the global Black diaspora. And so we have a question in the Q&A that asked, what role does contemporary art from Africa and other diaspora communities play in local artist activism? So tying what's happening here to what may be happening in other parts of that continuum within the full diaspora of Blackness across the world. So either Heather, Fabian, want to chime in on that?
I mean, I'll just share, like, it's not even what role does it play, like it plays a part, it exists. I remember a couple of years ago going to Cartagena in Colombia and visiting Palenque, a community that has retained the culture and traditions, West African culture and traditions. And I remember touring this little community and turning a corner and seeing a mural that said Black Lives Matter in English. Black Lives Matter, right? Thousands of miles away in a part of the world for which English is not their first language, in which sort of like the politics of their place are not exactly ours, but there's this resonance, right? There's this connection. And I think it's leaning more into that, like leaning more into this membership of ours in this diaspora community as we are rallying around all of these challenges of oppression and brutality and economic injustice. Like, how do we begin to really coordinate and organize, not just on our geographic turf where we live, but across the globe? I think that's like where the power is. And I think artists have the ability to connect those dots. And when we talk about imagination and when we talk about futurism, I think that is part of that liberation resistance movement, is connecting all of those pieces together and reminding us, because the powers that be have done a really good job of disconnecting us. But it's the art that's always played the part in keeping us connected.
Fabian, your handle is occasional superstar, and you know your work exists in this space of connecting to a much larger community beyond the Atlanta area. So, in thinking about your work in a global context, and thinking about your work, your perspective as tied to other African communities or Black communities that kind of maybe diasporic. How do you see what you're doing tapping into larger conversations that may exist beyond, you know, the 404, the 770, 678, et cetera? How do you see that? Can't hear you.
Sorry. I look at art as like the control modules for like the algorithm of our social uh, social machine. You know, art controls culture, culture controls people, and so we as Black people, like our art is infused into our like our everyday. You know, some in our music, our clothes, how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, and if the art is given the correct value systems for all those things, then the people will follow those value systems throughout their lives. And I think that governments know this. And the reason why propaganda is so important and powerful is because it is setting the value standards for everything in your society. And so when authoritarians step up to play, first thing they get rid of is the artists, because we're the ones that control the value systems. And in music, like look at our music now, look at how hip hop was and how hip hop is now. And what are the value systems that it started with versus the value systems that it perpetuates now? It's like just not the same. They took a very small portion of hip hop and then, you know, made it all over, you know, and it just they took over radio with it, and it's not natural. So, you know, like if artists realize how much power they have and how a mural on the wall can like change the vibration of a block, you know, or like a whole neighborhood full of murals, how that changes how people feel when they walk out the house, you know. I mean, African people, we've been doing this for, you know, since the jump. You know, there's always two streams of communication when it comes to like, you know, art. There's like the you know, the creative part of it, and then there's the part that talks to your subconscious, and it all speaks, you know. So I feel like once Black people kind of like realize that and really take a hold of it, then our situation will change.
And say, I want to get tactical with you for a moment, because you mentioned that you know, you and your organization are doing work in all 159 counties of this state. So I'm sure you have seen a variety of, you know, types of organizing, whether it be, you know, metro, urban spaces, rural spaces, North Georgia, South Georgia. If we're getting tactical, and if there are artists in this space who are listening to us having this conversation, and they're thinking about, you know, what are some of the tactics that I could be employing to either further advance my voice, advance my engagement or influence with my public officials, both now and the future ones that are, you know, voted into office soon. What should we be doing short term, long term, and just consistently throughout, you know, however we're moving in these spaces? Just give us anything that kind of comes to mind for you in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think first for me would always be, and people who know me personally, you might chuckle because I'm known as an introvert, but to join an organization, I think that every single person here should have a political home or an organizing home. Right. I subscribe to the choir theory of organizing, the idea being like the reason that gospel choirs hold notes, beautiful notes for so long, is because each individual is holding their note and doing their part, doing what they can to contribute to the song. And so there are people that share your values. There are things that are super important to you that, again, things that you can't stand to see continue. Or there's a vision that you have for your city, for your state, that you want to make real. And I guarantee you that there are other people who are aligned in that same way. And so I would say first, what's your political home? Who do you organize with? And again, not that you got to be at all the meetings and all the functions, but when I think about the people who I love who are in recovery, like one of the things that has been sort of one of the markers of success, right, for them is that like every Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the basement of St. Michael's, it's going to be cookies, it's going to be juice, and there's going to be a meeting, right? That regardless of whatever you got going on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. in the basement of St. Michael's, it's going to be cookies, juice, and a meeting, right? There are people there who are committed to one another's recovery. I think that a lot of movement organizations, political organizations function similarly, right? That there, again, are people who share your values, who care about the things that you care about. And this is the time where, as they say in the South or in the Black church, it's not a regional thing, it's a Black church thing. Your time, your talent, or your treasure, what you have. And I remember being a broke boy and definitely having more time than treasure in my younger days. Fortunately, knock on wood, that has flipped. And so for movements, candidates, things that I care about, I vote with my dollars. And I think that that's also something that I would encourage people to do. I think, so one is definitely join an organization. Find your political home or your organizing home. I think the second thing is to do the hard work of identifying what is your vision for yourself, for your family, for your community. If it's the community of artists that you find yourself in, or even like the community that you actually live in, that's really, really important. Because as Fabian told you, like, what would you be? Like if we could snap our fingers and white supremacy wasn't like a controlling political sort of framework for how things get done in this country, in this moment, at this time, like what would you be doing? Like what stories would you be telling? What would you be creating, right? And so you certainly can't achieve it if your mind can't even conceive of it, right? So what is it that you want? What does peace look like? What does rest look like? What does joy look like? What does it mean to be supported by your elected officials? Because here's the thing, and as Fabian said it earlier, we're all really, really good at talking about all the things that we hate. I hate that. I hate that. I hate him. I hate her. The things, the people, the places that we hate, the conditions that we hate, we're very good at it. I want us to become as fluent in the abundant vision that you have for yourselves. Like, what are you willing to fight for? If you can't even articulate it, are we even on the battlefield? So what is it that you want? Getting clear about it. And then finding your people and joining an organization.
Heather, I feel like you have become you've both invested in and become the face of a lot of the organizing work in the Atlanta arts community relative to resources, right? And so I guess from where you sit, both locally nationally, however, you may direct your intention, right? What are the conversations that you want to have, or you feel like you're empowered to sort of foster between elected officials and policymakers in the arts community in terms of building that dialogue that then becomes something that becomes a movement that then becomes action? What are your priorities, or in terms of what you're wanting to foster, but also when it comes to again that accountability between the policymakers, elected officials, and the community? Like, what are you prioritizing, and what do you want to advance?
Yeah, I'm prioritizing Black, and that in saying that, I'm not excluding anybody. I'm actually including every single person when I say Black. And wanting to get leaders of institutions and politicians to get on that thinking as well, that it is the most inclusive term and way of thinking about work as it relates to resources specifically. Because if I think about just the advocacy that was done with the Community Foundation, for example, like in the moment of Black Lives Matter and social unrest, the minute that they were able to emphasize Black and make some modifications to their grant making practice, it opened up opportunities for smaller organizations that were also being disenfranchised and marginalized, not just Black institutions, but everybody that found themselves on the outside of being able to benefit from these resources. And it was only when we focused on Black organizations that we were able to usher in that kind of, new grant making practice. There was a time when I came to Atlanta in '95 and like immersed myself in the National Black Arts Festival, which was a citywide, fully embraced by city leadership, corporate Atlanta, and all of that. Like, people were saying Black back then. They were saying Black, and they were saying people of African descent. And I was reminded this when I was preparing a speech for some organization, and I went into the Auburn Research Archives where the National Black Arts Festival has put a lot of their old documents. And I saw AT&T using the word Black. We celebrate the Black arts community, right? Like those terms were being used, and somehow over the years, we've really diluted that, and we've gone out of our way to say everything but Black. We're using terms like BIPOC and POC, and it's becoming ridiculous because now I heard like non-POC. I mean, like all of these terms. And so yeah, my priority is to center Blackness and to remind people that in centering Blackness, we are not excluding anyone, that in a place like Atlanta, given its history and its legacy, and that it's still a very much Black majority city, that when we can solve for these challenges that these communities are contending with, we are literally solving for everybody else. And it doesn't actually take a whole lot of investment and effort. It really doesn't. It's just having, and it's not even a courage thing. I mean, like whatever people have to overcome in order to center Blackness, it's just the thing that they have to do. And what I'm most concerned about in these ongoing conversations around equity is what is happening now from a funding standpoint, is that these white institutions are acknowledging equity is the new hot term for these funders specifically, and politicians follow suit, and they're crafting their messages to do outreach to Black communities, but they're still bringing their white, Western centered programming to these communities, but they're getting these funding dollars, or they're offering free space to Black organizations, right? And then checking their box for equity. And what's happening is the Black institutions continue to be redlined, right? The money is going through a white institution to get to them, right? We're still not getting the point. Like you need to cut them out and bring it over here. So yeah, that's the ongoing saga.
I want to just sort of take a bit of a sort of a different approach, but still staying on what you're talking about, Heather. And I want to acknowledge Martin Norwood, who's been active in the chat throughout this conversation. Martin asked a question earlier. I think so. One, I think a lot of what we're confronting has been part of a continuum of how things have been done historically in these spaces for quite some time. And so Martin asked a question does lineage matter, and like, you know, how are we addressing notions of like lineage and like maybe even disrupting that a little bit, but just thinking about, you know, acknowledging the past of how it has been done, but then maybe trying to reframe what has to be done or what should be done going forward, for what we want to be, what we want the city to be and how we want it to actually run. So just want to at least like infuse that into the conversation, or at least acknowledge that as part of this conversation. I have about 5 minutes left. And so I want to give everyone a chance to kind of have some final words here. Fabian, I want to ask you first. I know you still may be on a wall somewhere in the city doing some work. If you're able to tap back in, would you please tap back in for a little bit?
Oh yeah, I've been listening the whole time.
Okay,
I
cool.
was just
So real quick, show us what you're working on. If you can just show us like where you are and just what you're doing. I think the audience may be just super interested to kind of know like what you're focusing on right now.
Well, right now I'm at 1654 Jonesboro Road, and it's one of the sites of the Kaepernick Capper Bowl. This was one of the pieces done by Usley Matherin, and beside it is this aging piece. It's actually Jesus. I did it for Killer Mike's show, Trigger Warning. And I'm actually going to refurbish that after I'm done with this. Let me turn my screen around. I just laid in the hieroglyphics for this. You can't really see it on the wall. It's going to be real fun to paint because this has a lot of detail and stuff in it. And I meant fun in a sarcastic way. It's going to be a mother and son flying through the air, propelled by their words, I will create as I write. And wrapped around them will be the quote box like you would see in a comic book, but the words are like propelling them through the air like centrifugal motion. And hieroglyphics around them is the word abracadabra, which means I will create as I speak.
Thank you for that, Fabian. Hopefully everyone, you know, appreciates. We got a bit of an artist talk, a little bit of art kind of worked into this conversation, you know, real time. So Fabian, thank you for at least showing us what you're working on right now as we sort of catch you mid process on this Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
But just final thoughts on this conversation, Fabian.
Well, I was gonna let you know I'm at 1654 Jonesboro Road, Lakewood Heights business district. And you saying my thoughts on the what?
Just as we wrap up this conversation on arts, policy, politics, the intention behind that, and just sort of as we look forward to this, you know, upcoming election season or just this ongoing political season, just your final thoughts on what we talked about today and what you want to leave anyone with from you and where your head is right now.
Well, you know, in terms of politics and art, I feel like now is a great time to like use your art to speak your politics. But also keep in mind your audience, who you're trying to talk to, and how much time you have to connect with them. The reason why I like doing murals is because, you know, coming from an advertising background, there's hardly a better way to capture somebody's attention than murals. You know, you can use color, medium, and, you know, location to communicate to people in a way that, you know, an ad in the phone can't. And there's really no limit to how good they can look as long as you're willing to put in the time. That's what I do in lieu of budget, unfortunately. Atlanta has never really given the arts community its fair shake. And I do believe part of it is because they don't understand it, but two, also they know how powerful art can be. And you know, why give such a powerful medium away to people that aren't involved in the mechanics of the finance and power controls? So, but I'm hoping that this next generation of younger artists, realize the potential of art, but also recognize the importance of politics and how they function in the community. And I think with all of them working in concert together, can really change, the just the feel of the city. I think that we're all discovering how public art plays a role in how things feel, as well as in schools. I'm doing a lot of work in schools right now, too, because I believe that a school full of intellectually stimulating art is better than plain walls. And why should I have to go to, or why should my kid have to go to the High Museum when they have a school that may have work by, some of the, more cherished artists in their own community? A lot of the artists that I looked up to live around here in the West End, in South Atlanta. I feel like their work should be in schools, as opposed to not just the High Museum, but they should be in the public and the elementary and middle and high school. I feel like it would just change how we perceive things. Okay, I know I'm talking about.
Thank you for that, Fabian. We appreciate your work, and thank you for giving us a bit of a tour of what you're working on this afternoon. Final thoughts, Insay.
Make sure y'all go vote November 2nd. And then again on November 30th, because it's 14 people running for mayor of Atlanta. And none of them is likely to get over 50% on November 2nd. So we're going to have to run it back on November 30th. I have a lot to say about that, but thinking about, voting is not a magic bullet at all, but it is definitely one of the least things that we can do as citizens to be heard, to signal the direction that we want our city and our county and our state to move into. So let's move the city forward. And for those of us who live in Atlanta, say no to toxic exes as a general rule, period, personally, professionally, and politically. And I'm excited about 22. We didn't even get a chance to talk about 2022, but they say that it's darkest before dawn. And so I want folks to know that I personally think it's like 4:45 in the morning for Black folks in Georgia. It's dark now, but we have to keep doing what we're doing because we're certainly moving in the right direction. And the defenders of the status quo are responding because we're winning, because we're making progress, because they're being convicted. And so, yeah.
Thank you for that, Insay. Heather, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. Don't be silent. Call that shit out. Call it out. Call it out. We don't have to settle for less. We shouldn't. Yeah. Call it out.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabian. Thank you, Insay. Thank you, Heather. Thank you to all of the attendees, both who are watching this live and those who may watch it in the future on a recorded stream somewhere in their own personal time. At this point, this brings this art salon to a close. I want to thank the Adama team. Constance, if you want to come back on and give some final thoughts, please do. I just wanted to, again, express my gratitude for being able to be part of this conversation and for everyone's time this afternoon and having this dialogue and this very important dialogue. And thank you, just again.
Thank you, Floyd.
Thank you, Floyd.
Awesome. So I think that wraps this up, and we'll catch you all the next time. So cheers.
Cheers.
Peace, Floyd. Thanks.